There are moments in life when betrayal arrives like a storm. Loud, sudden, impossible to ignore. And then there are betrayals that happen quietly. The kind that unfold over months, sometimes years, while you are still sharing meals with the people who are planning your downfall. For Eleanor Parker, the most devastating betrayal of her life did not come from a stranger. It did not come from a business rival or a criminal looking for easy money. It came from the people she loved most. The people she trusted without question. The people she believed would stand beside her until the end. On a cold morning in Chicago, Eleanor sat alone on a wooden bench outside a courtroom. Her hands trembled as she stared at the floor. Just 3 years earlier, she had been surrounded by family. She had a comfortable home, a stable marriage, and the confidence that comes from believing your loved ones would always protect you. Now she was sitting alone, fighting accusations that threatened to destroy her reputation forever. The most painful part was not what she had lost. It was discovering who had taken it from her. What Eleanor didn't know that morning was that within a few hours, a single piece of evidence would expose a secret so shocking that it would leave an entire family scrambling to save themselves. The people who had spent years convincing everyone that Eleanor was the problem were about to face questions they could no longer answer. Questions that would unravel everything they had worked so hard to hide. And when the truth finally surfaced, it revealed something far bigger than a family dispute over money. It revealed greed, manipulation, deception. It revealed a carefully constructed plan that had begun years before anyone realized what was happening. A plan designed to strip one woman of her inheritance, her credibility, and ultimately her future. But this story is not just about betrayal. It's about karma. Because sometimes the people who spend years building traps for others eventually become trapped by their own actions. Sometimes the lies that create wealth also create consequences. And sometimes justice arrives when nobody expects it. Before we go deeper into this remarkable story, let us know in the comments where you're watching from. We'd love to hear from you. And don't forget to hit that subscribe button so you never miss any of our upcoming videos. To understand how Eleanor Parker ended up sitting alone outside that courtroom, we need to go back several years earlier. Back to a time when her family appeared to have everything. A successful marriage, close relationships with their children, financial security, the kind of life many people spend decades trying to build. From the outside, Richard Parker looked like a devoted husband. Friends described him as reliable, intelligent, and hardworking. He had spent most of his career managing finances and advising clients on important decisions. People trusted him. They respected him. They listened when he spoke. Their daughter Melissa seemed equally successful. She was ambitious, confident, and determined to build a life of her own. Their son Michael was charming and outgoing, someone who could walk into any room and make friends within minutes. Together they appeared to be the kind of family that others admired. Yet beneath the surface, small cracks had already begun to form. The first signs were easy to miss. A conversation here, a disagreement there, a comment about money that seemed harmless at the time. Nothing dramatic, nothing alarming, at least not yet. The turning point arrived when Eleanor's father passed away. For years, he had been a respected businessman who built a considerable estate through discipline and persistence. He was known as a man who valued loyalty above almost everything else. He believed character mattered more than wealth. He often reminded his family that money could solve many problems, but it could also reveal truths people preferred to keep hidden. When he died, grief spread through the family. Friends attended the funeral. Relatives shared memories. Everyone spoke about honoring his legacy. But as the weeks passed and discussions about his estate began, something changed. The atmosphere became tense. Conversations became guarded. People who once laughed together started watching each other carefully. And then came the reading of the will. It lasted less than an hour. But the consequences would change every life involved. When the attorney revealed the details, silence filled the room. No one argued. No one raised their voice. No one stormed out. But sometimes the most dangerous reactions are the quiet ones. Because while Eleanor believed her family would accept her father's final wishes, someone else in that room was already calculating opportunities. Someone was already thinking about money. Someone was already wondering how to take control. And before long, a series of decisions would set this family on a path toward betrayal, heartbreak, and a reckoning none of them saw coming. What happened next would transform a loving family into bitter enemies. And it all started with an inheritance. The attorney carefully explained the details of the estate. Eleanor's father had not divided everything equally. Instead, he had placed the majority of his assets under Eleanor's supervision. It was not because she was his favorite child. It was because over the years she had proven herself trustworthy, patient, and responsible. She had helped manage many of his personal affairs during his final years. She attended appointments, handled paperwork, and remained by his side when others were busy with their own lives. Her father believed she would protect what he had built and ensure it benefited future generations. At first, nobody openly challenged the decision. Richard nodded politely. Melissa forced a smile. Michael thanked the attorney for his time. To an outsider, everything appeared perfectly civil. But people often reveal their true feelings after the room becomes quiet. That evening, after returning home, Eleanor noticed something unusual. Richard seemed distracted. Throughout dinner, he barely spoke. When she asked whether he was feeling all right, he simply said he was tired. She accepted the explanation because after 32 years of marriage, trust had become second nature. She never imagined that while she was thinking about honoring her father's wishes, Richard was thinking about something entirely different. Over the following weeks, subtle changes began appearing. Melissa called more frequently than usual. Michael suddenly became interested in financial discussions he had previously ignored. Richard asked detailed questions about the estate, questions about account access, questions about property records, questions about investment portfolios. Again, none of it seemed alarming. Family members often discuss money after the death of a loved one. Eleanor assumed everyone was simply trying to understand the situation. What she could not see was that private conversations were taking place without her knowledge. Conversations that grew increasingly focused on one idea: control. Melissa believed her grandfather had been unfair. Michael complained that Eleanor had been given too much authority. Richard listened carefully, and little by little, he began encouraging those frustrations. The conversations started innocently enough. What if Mom makes the wrong decisions? What if the assets lose value? What if Grandpa made a mistake? Questions became doubts. Doubts became suspicions. And suspicions slowly transformed into resentment. Months passed. The family gatherings that once felt warm now carried an uncomfortable tension. Holiday dinners became shorter. Phone calls became less frequent. Arguments emerged over issues that previously would have been forgotten within minutes. Eleanor found herself walking through conversations as if she were crossing thin ice. Every word seemed to matter. Every decision was questioned. Every choice attracted criticism. The situation became even more confusing because nobody directly accused her of anything. Instead, they planted small suggestions. Comments that sounded harmless. Remarks disguised as concern. Questions framed as curiosity. Yet each one carried the same message. Maybe Eleanor wasn't capable. Maybe Eleanor shouldn't be trusted. Maybe Eleanor was becoming selfish. The accusations were subtle enough that she struggled to defend herself. How do you respond to criticism that is never spoken openly? How do you confront people who smile while quietly undermining your credibility? For the first time in her life, Eleanor began questioning herself. Was she being too cautious? Too protective? Too controlling? The doubts crept into her thoughts during sleepless nights. And that was exactly what Richard wanted. Because while Eleanor wrestled with uncertainty, he was building confidence elsewhere. Confidence among family members. Confidence among advisors. Confidence among anyone willing to listen. Slowly, a narrative began taking shape. Richard portrayed himself as the reasonable voice of concern. Melissa presented herself as a worried daughter. Michael acted like a son trying to protect family interests. Together, they painted a picture that was completely different from reality. A picture in which Eleanor was no longer the responsible daughter entrusted with an estate. Instead, she became the obstacle standing between them and the money they believed should belong to them. As months turned into a year, the campaign against Eleanor grew stronger. Friends she had known for decades started acting differently. Some stopped calling altogether. Others became distant during conversations. A few even hinted that they had heard troubling rumors. Rumors that made no sense. Rumors suggesting Eleanor was struggling to manage her responsibilities. Rumors suggesting she was making irrational decisions. Rumors suggesting she could no longer be trusted with important financial matters. Every time Eleanor tried to trace the source, she found nothing concrete. No evidence. No direct accusation. Only whispers. And whispers can be incredibly powerful, because once enough people hear the same story, they begin treating it like the truth. What Eleanor didn't know was that while her reputation was quietly being dismantled, something far more alarming was happening behind closed doors. Money was moving. Small amounts at first. Amounts too insignificant to attract attention. Then larger amounts. Transfers hidden inside complex transactions. Records that appeared legitimate on the surface. The kind of financial activity most people would never notice. And the people responsible believed they had designed the perfect plan. A plan that would allow them to gain control while ensuring all suspicion remained focused on Eleanor. For a time, it worked. No one questioned them. No one investigated. No one looked closely enough. But every deception leaves traces. And somewhere inside thousands of pages of financial records, a mistake had already been made. A mistake so small that nobody noticed it at first. Yet within 2 years, that single error would begin exposing a secret worth millions of dollars. A secret that would ultimately bring everything crashing down. And the first person to notice it wasn't a detective. It wasn't an attorney. It wasn't even a member of the Parker family. It was a young accountant reviewing paperwork on an ordinary Tuesday afternoon. What she discovered would change everything. The accountant's name was Hannah Brooks. She had only been with the firm for 8 months and was still considered one of the newest employees in the office. Most of her work involved reviewing documents, organizing financial records, and preparing reports for senior staff. It was not the type of position that usually uncovered major scandals. In fact, most days were routine. Numbers went in, numbers came out, reports were filed, cases were closed. But on that particular Tuesday afternoon, something caught her attention. At first, it seemed insignificant. A transfer appeared in one set of records, but was described differently in another. The amount wasn't enormous. Certainly not enough to trigger immediate concern. Yet the inconsistency bothered her. Hannah checked the entry again, then a third time. The numbers matched. The dates matched. But the explanations did not. Most people would have ignored it and moved on. Hannah didn't. She opened additional files. Then more. And before long, she noticed another discrepancy. Then another. And another. Each one by itself appeared harmless. Together, they painted a very different picture. Over the next several days, Hannah quietly reviewed hundreds of transactions. She wasn't trying to uncover fraud. She was simply attempting to understand why the records didn't align properly. The deeper she looked, the more unusual the transactions became. Money had been moving through multiple accounts, then into companies, then into other accounts, then into investment vehicles. The trail seemed unnecessarily complicated, as if someone wanted the money to become difficult to follow. Eventually, Hannah brought her concerns to a senior partner. The partner listened carefully before asking a simple question. How much money are we talking about? Hannah estimated the total. The room became silent. Because the figure wasn't thousands. It wasn't hundreds of thousands. It was several $million. For the first time, experienced professionals began examining the records themselves. Within days, internal reviews were launched. Outside auditors were consulted. Financial specialists were brought in. And the more experts looked, the worse the situation appeared. The money had not disappeared by accident. Someone had moved it deliberately. The question was who? At first, investigators considered every possibility. Perhaps an employee had manipulated records. Perhaps an outside fraudster had gained access. Perhaps a trusted advisor had abused their authority. Each theory seemed possible, yet none of them fit perfectly. The transactions required access, knowledge, timing. Whoever orchestrated the transfers understood the estate from the inside. They knew which accounts would attract attention and which would not. They understood reporting procedures. They anticipated routine reviews. Most importantly, they knew exactly where suspicion was focused. On Eleanor. And that realization changed everything. Because suddenly investigators began asking a new question. What if the campaign against Eleanor wasn't separate from the missing money? What if it was connected? What if someone had intentionally damaged her credibility to ensure nobody would question what was happening elsewhere? The possibility was disturbing. Yet, as evidence accumulated, it became increasingly difficult to ignore. Meanwhile, Eleanor remained unaware of the investigation. Her own problems consumed her attention. Legal disputes continued. Relationships deteriorated. Former friends avoided her. Even simple trips to the grocery store became uncomfortable. People whispered. Some stared. Others looked away. Years of trust had been replaced by doubt. And perhaps the most painful part was watching her children drift further away. Melissa rarely called anymore. When she did, conversations felt cold, forced. Michael became even more distant. Weeks sometimes passed without contact. Richard remained in the house, but emotionally, he seemed miles away. The marriage that had once survived decades of challenges now felt like a carefully maintained performance. Eleanor often found herself lying awake long after midnight, replaying events in her mind. She searched for answers. She searched for reasons. She searched for the moment everything changed. But betrayal rarely announces itself. It grows quietly until one day the damage becomes impossible to ignore. One evening, Eleanor sat alone in her living room looking through old family photographs. Birthdays, graduations, summer vacations, Christmas mornings. Every picture captured moments of happiness, moments that now felt strangely distant. As she turned each page, one question kept returning. How had her family reached this point? How had the people she loved become strangers? What she didn't know was that while she searched for answers in old photographs, investigators were finding answers inside financial records. Answers that would soon expose a truth far more devastating than she imagined. Weeks later, the audit team reached a breakthrough. The shell companies receiving money from the estate appeared unrelated at first glance. Different names, different addresses, different business activities. But when investigators compared ownership records, patterns began emerging. Names connected to other names, addresses connected to other addresses, businesses connected to additional entities. It resembled a puzzle with thousands of pieces, and slowly, those pieces began fitting together. Then came the discovery that changed the entire case. One of the companies contained a document that should never have existed, a document linking the operation to a person investigators knew very well. When auditors saw the signature, several stared at the page in disbelief, because the name belonged to Richard Parker, the trusted husband, the concerned family man, the person who had spent years portraying himself as the reasonable voice in every dispute. Suddenly, everything looked different. The rumors, the accusations, the legal challenges, the attempts to remove Eleanor from control. Every event that once seemed unrelated now appeared connected. If Richard was involved, investigators needed to know how deeply. Was he acting alone? Had someone helped him? And perhaps most importantly, did Melissa and Michael know what was happening? The next phase of the investigation would answer those questions, and the answers would shock even the people conducting it. Because what started as a dispute over inheritance was about to become something much larger, something that threatened to destroy an entire family. Investigators knew better than to jump to conclusions. A signature alone was not enough. Documents could be forged. Names could appear in places without direct involvement. They needed proof. Real proof. The kind that could survive scrutiny from attorneys, accountants, and eventually a courtroom. So they kept digging. Bank records led to corporate filings. Corporate filings led to tax records. Tax records led to communications. Emails, contracts, authorizations, meeting notes. Every new piece of information revealed another layer of the story. And the deeper they looked, the harder it became for Richard's explanations to hold together. The money trail stretched across multiple entities, but the decision-making authority repeatedly circled back to the same small group of people. The same names appeared again and again, sometimes directly, sometimes hidden through intermediaries. Yet the pattern remained impossible to ignore. Then investigators uncovered something even more troubling. Several transactions had occurred shortly after major disputes involving Eleanor. Whenever her authority over parts of the estate faced challenges, money seemed to move elsewhere. Whenever new rumors about her competence spread, transfers followed. The timing was far too consistent to be coincidence. It suggested coordination, planning, intent. And once investigators began comparing dates side by side, a disturbing picture emerged. The effort to discredit Eleanor and the movement of money appeared to be happening simultaneously. One operation distracted attention. The other generated financial benefit. Together, they created a system that protected itself. As long as everyone focused on Eleanor, nobody looked closely at the accounts. As long as people questioned her judgment, few questioned Richard's. It was a strategy that had worked remarkably well for years. But no plan survives forever, especially when greed becomes involved. Because greed has a habit of demanding more. And the more someone takes, the more evidence they leave behind. Meanwhile, Richard remained confident. Friends who spoke with him later would describe a man who appeared completely unconcerned. He attended social events. He discussed future investments. He made long-term plans. Nothing about his behavior suggested someone worried about an investigation. In fact, Richard seemed to believe he had already won. From his perspective, Eleanor's reputation had been damaged beyond repair. Control of key assets had been challenged. Relationships had fractured. The narrative favored him. Why would he expect danger? After all, nobody knew what he knew. Or at least that's what he believed. But confidence can be dangerous when built upon false assumptions. Because while Richard continued living as though the situation was under control, another development was unfolding. One that would bring investigators closer to the truth than ever before. A forensic accounting team was assigned to review archived communications connected to the estate. Their job was simple: reconstruct decision-making processes, determine who approved what, identify potential irregularities. The assignment seemed routine, until they discovered a series of deleted messages. Most people assume deleting a message makes it disappear forever. In reality, digital records often leave traces. And those traces can tell stories. Stories people desperately want hidden. The recovered communications covered several years. At first glance, many appeared harmless. Discussions about meetings, questions about paperwork, comments regarding investments. Then the language began changing. Conversations became more strategic, more deliberate, more revealing. Investigators found discussions about public perception, discussions about influence, discussions about positioning Eleanor as unreliable. One message referred to creating the right narrative. Another discussed convincing certain individuals to support legal action. A third suggested waiting until the timing is favorable. None of the messages explicitly described stealing money. Yet together, they painted a picture of calculated manipulation. And then investigators found something that left even seasoned professionals stunned. A communication involving Melissa. For months, investigators had struggled to determine whether the children were active participants or simply influenced by Richard's version of events. The answer now sat directly in front of them. Melissa wasn't merely aware of what was happening. She had been involved. The evidence suggested she helped coordinate conversations with family members and advisors. She helped spread doubts regarding Eleanor's competence. She encouraged others to support efforts aimed at removing her mother's authority. For investigators, this changed everything. The case was no longer focused on one individual. It was expanding. And if Melissa was involved, what about Michael? That question became the next priority. The answer arrived sooner than expected. Financial records revealed connections between certain transferred funds and debts Michael had quietly accumulated over several years. Business ventures that failed, loans that remained unpaid, investments that produced losses, pressures he had worked hard to conceal. The money flowing through various entities appeared to benefit him indirectly. Investigators now faced a painful conclusion. This wasn't simply a husband betraying his wife. This wasn't merely an inheritance dispute. This was a family operation driven by money. A family operation that had slowly consumed trust, loyalty, and relationships. The very things Eleanor's father valued most. As evidence continued accumulating, legal teams began preparing for what would come next. Subpoenas, interviews, asset reviews, formal proceedings. The investigation was moving from discovery into action. And once that process began, keeping secrets would become far more difficult. For the first time, the people who spent years placing Eleanor under scrutiny were about to experience scrutiny themselves. But even then, one critical piece of the puzzle remained missing. Investigators understood how the money moved. They understood who benefited. They understood how Eleanor had been targeted. Yet one question still lingered. Why had Richard started all of this in the first place? Was it simply greed? Was it resentment? Or was there another motive hidden beneath everything else? The answer would emerge from a source nobody expected. A source that had remained silent for years. And when that source finally spoke, It would reveal the real reason this family fell apart. A reason that would leave Eleanor heartbroken all over again. As legal pressure increased, the people who had once appeared united began turning against one another. That is often what happens when loyalty is built on shared secrets instead of shared values. The same individuals who spent years protecting one another suddenly became concerned with protecting themselves. Investigators noticed the change almost immediately. Stories that once matched perfectly began containing contradictions. Details shifted. Timelines changed. Explanations became less convincing. The confidence that had carried Richard through years of deception slowly disappeared. Then came the moment that changed everything. One of the individuals connected to the investigation agreed to cooperate fully. The decision sent shockwaves through everyone involved. Because once someone starts talking, the truth has a way of spreading quickly. Documents were explained. Meetings were described. Conversations were revealed. And at the center of it all stood Richard. The man who had spent years convincing others that Eleanor was the problem. The man who presented himself as a devoted husband. The man who claimed every action was motivated by concern for his family. According to testimony and evidence, Richard's resentment had started long before Eleanor's father passed away. For years, he quietly believed he deserved greater control over the family's financial future. He believed his experience and expertise entitled him to authority. When Eleanor's father chose Eleanor instead, Richard viewed the decision as a personal rejection. What began as disappointment gradually transformed into bitterness. That bitterness became resentment. And eventually resentment became a plan. A plan that required convincing others to see Eleanor as an obstacle. A plan that required weakening her credibility. A plan that ultimately consumed the entire family. When Eleanor learned the full truth, she described the feeling as losing her husband twice. The first loss occurred when he betrayed her. The second occurred when she realized the man she trusted had been hiding his true intentions for years. The marriage she thought she had was built on a foundation she no longer recognized. The legal consequences arrived swiftly. Assets connected to the scheme were frozen. Properties became subject to review. Financial penalties followed. Years of carefully accumulated wealth began disappearing. The money that motivated so much betrayal suddenly became inaccessible. And perhaps the cruelest irony of all was that the fortune everyone fought so desperately to control no longer belonged to them. During final reviews of the estate, attorneys uncovered a sealed letter written by Eleanor's father years before his death. The contents stunned everyone. In the letter, he explained that wealth often reveals character more clearly than hardship. He expressed hope that his family would remain united after he was gone. Yet he also acknowledged the possibility that greed could influence future decisions. As a precaution, he included specific instructions regarding misconduct involving the estate. If substantial fraud, manipulation, or abuse of authority was ever discovered, significant portions of the remaining assets would be redirected elsewhere. Not to the individuals involved, not to those who benefited, but to charitable organizations and beneficiaries chosen years earlier. The very people who tried to gain everything ended up receiving almost nothing. The wealth they sacrificed relationships for slipped beyond their reach forever. For many observers, it felt like karma in its purest form. Not because someone sought revenge, not because Eleanor demanded punishment, but because every decision eventually produced consequences. And those consequences finally arrived. Melissa and Michael faced a reality they never anticipated. In pursuing financial gain, they had lost something far more valuable. Their relationship with their mother had been damaged. Their family name had been tarnished. The trust they once shared could not simply be restored with an apology. Richard's fall was even more dramatic. The reputation he spent decades building disappeared. Professional relationships ended. Friends distanced themselves. The respect he once enjoyed vanished. He had spent years trying to take control of Eleanor's future. Instead, he lost control of his own. As for Eleanor, many people expected her to celebrate. They expected anger, vindication, perhaps even revenge. Instead, her reaction surprised nearly everyone. She felt relief. Relief that the truth was finally known. Relief that she no longer had to defend herself against lies. Relief that her father's faith in her had ultimately been justified. But there was sadness too. Because winning the truth did not erase the pain. It did not restore lost years. It did not bring back the family she once believed she had. Some victories come with scars. and this was one of them. Over time, Eleanor rebuilt her life. She focused on meaningful friendships. She became involved in charitable causes that reflected her father's values. She found purpose outside the conflict that had consumed so many years. Little by little, peace returned. Not because she forgot what happened, but because she refused to let betrayal define the rest of her life. And perhaps that became the greatest lesson of all. The people who betrayed her believed money was the prize. They believed wealth would bring happiness, security, and power. Instead, their pursuit of money cost them trust, reputation, relationships, and ultimately the very fortune they wanted so badly. Eleanor lost many things during those difficult years, but she kept her integrity. And in the end, that proved more valuable than anything sitting in a bank account. Stories like this remind us that greed rarely arrives all at once. It often starts with small justifications, small compromises, small decisions that seem harmless in the moment. Yet over time, those decisions grow larger until they reshape entire lives. So now we'd like to hear from you. Do you think Eleanor could ever truly forgive the people who betrayed her? If you were in her position, would you have given your family another chance? Or do some betrayals cross a line that can never be repaired? Let us know your thoughts in the comments below. And if you enjoyed this story, don't forget to subscribe to Evelyn Tales for more unforgettable stories of betrayal, shocking revelations, and karma that changes everything. Because sometimes the truth stays hidden for years. And sometimes, when it finally emerges, it changes everything.